In the Season 6 two-part premiere episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer entitled Bargaining, Buffy's friends conjure dark magics to bring her back from the dead. She died saving the world from destruction in the last episode of Season 5, ostensibly a climax to the series itself. Buffy struggles to accept that she is back and flesh-bound. Her friends have decided that they couldn't take the chance that she was suffering torment in a hell dimension. But it's established that she was actually pulled from heaven by her friends into a harsh reality where she is deeply in debt and still fighting things that go bump in the night. A warrior resurrected without choice. A series renewed out of greed. The message is this: a good thing cannot stay dead. Always there exists the drive to see what fuel is left in the tank and if it can endure one more round. Hollywood is no stranger to this idea, forever resurrecting dormant franchises with reboots due to the perception of guaranteed money in a recognized brand. Recently, however, legacy sequels have been favored over remakes, where actors will reprise a favored role for a reflective look at a popular title from yesteryear. Despite the shift in form, the principle is the same: give them more of what they loved. However, Freddy Krueger has been in cinematic exile for 14 years now, despite many of his contemporaries making a return. I'm going to examine the possible reasons for the series' sharp decline and its current lack of return. Slasher horror, perhaps more than any other subgenre of horror, has existed on an adherence to formula. During the slasher boom following films such as Halloween and Friday the 13th, it became incredibly difficult for a film to stand out from the pack, as both films inspired countless imitations. Wes Craven breathed new life into the subgenre by writing a new rule: that what is seen is not always what is real, but that the implications can be just as deadly. So now I want to take a look through some scenes of the original Nightmare and talk about what I've observed about why they work, particularly for a first-time audience. This is the film's opening scene where Freddy is building his glove. This establishes the grimy, real Freddy before throwing us into the first nightmare. Only we haven't been given enough information as an audience to know we're in a nightmare. Tina could just be a girl lost in the wrong place, maybe kidnapped by the predator we see building the glove. The environment she's in appears dark and labyrinthine, but not abnormal. The lamb coming out and scaring her isn't even that much of a disruption, because it's preceded by the clanging of a metal door opening, as if to keep things feeling real diegetically. The lamb hasn't just appeared from nowhere. She is in a nightmarish place, but not necessarily a nightmare. It could just as easily be Leatherface's slaughterhouse. There's no indication of anything otherworldly until Freddy inexplicably pops up behind Tina out of nowhere, and the next thing we see is Tina waking up from her dream. Having established the mixing of waking life and reality, shortly after, Craven cuts to the first shot of the little girls playing jump rope and the introduction to the nursery rhyme. The girls are shot in slow motion and in a soft, focused, dreamlike haze, much like we'd see in Lynch's dissection of the evils lurking beneath white picket fence suburbia in Blue Velvet. As the shot moves past the girls, the image clears, establishing the real, all done in one motion without a cut. That the girls and the characters we follow seem to share a space is suggestive of the idea that the barrier separating dreams from waking life is permeable. This delicately plants the thematic and narrative seed that Craven uses to keep manipulating the audience's perspective. Then they build up to Tina's death scene. In the beginning, Craven offers us no real clue to the fact that we are in a nightmare because nothing about the setting has changed. But we are, as an audience, armed with the knowledge that our previous threat to Tina was in a dream. We know that our characters dreamt about the killer, but the environment suggests we are in safe territory, even though the music tells us it's not. Craven then unseats the audience by cutting to Nancy asleep in Tina's bed. Here we are watching the real sleeping character nearly getting pounced on by the killer. This happens again in the iconic scene where Nancy falls asleep in the bath and Freddy's glove penetrates the water, reaching for her. From our perspective, dreams and reality now share the same space, with nothing to distinguish one from the other. This does not just serve to disorientate the audience, however, but to help us identify with the character of Nancy, whose own perspective on this barrier becomes similarly muddled from her continued efforts to stay awake.
I'm crazy after all.
By the time we get to the end, we've witnessed bizarre imagery such as a tongue appearing from a phone and a fountain of blood emerging from a bed, apparently all in a waking perspective. But then the final scene returns to the same soft focus haze and the girl's jumping rope, seemingly acting like a bookend and making the audience re-examine everything they've just seen. Craven also explores and attempts to subvert the expectation of typical horror setups. For instance, in the scene where Nancy falls asleep in class. This time the initial threat isn't Freddy, but grief. Here Tina's corpse is ghoulishly and invisibly puppeteered by Freddy, body bag and all, taunting Nancy to come out just as he did Tina with the stones at her window. Nancy follows, and as she rounds the corner she bumps into Freddy in the guise of a hall monitor, giving us a jump scare. But rather than turn this into a confrontation, this is merely another taunt, as he watches Nancy continue to follow the sickly trail left by Tina's corpse. The pace drops and Nancy begins her slow descent into the boiler room. In one shot we see Freddy's eyes as he watches her from a hidden vantage point. This is a curious addition. It suggests that although he can manipulate the environment, he is not a part of it. Although he is omnipotent, he is not omnipresent. It even suggests that there are rules to the dream world and to Freddy that ground them both, rules to which we are not yet privy. But although Freddy can appear from anywhere, he simply steps out to confront Nancy. Craven doesn't feel compelled to keep trying to shock the audience. Although both Tina and Nancy being teased out and led into Freddy's clutches may seem like stupid decisions to an informed horror audience, Craven subverts this by having these choices take place in dreams. The actions are those of the subconscious, and therefore not bound by what horror movie logic would dictate as reasonable. But as Nancy's acceptance of her situation increases, and her agency is elevated, what begins as a trap becomes a challenge. Nancy is lured into the boiler room the first time, but by the end of the film makes as conscious a choice as possible to go back in and face her tormentor. Moving on now to look at the wider series and the nature of diminishing returns. Freddy's Revenge has undergone a great deal of re-examination in the last decade or so, and come to be embraced by the fans as one of the premier gay horror films. The history to this text within the film has been explored already in Never Sleep Again and the fascinating Scream Queen, My Nightmare on Elm Street, about Mark Patton's experience making Elm Street 2. And more informed people than me have spoken to its homoerotic or even potentially homophobic readings, so I'll put that to one side. Its greatest flaw is that it doesn't follow on from the original Elm Street, really. There's little sense of continuity, and plainly no real interest in following either the narrative or the principles laid down by Craven. Some of the effects work is embarrassing. At other times, though, it's wonderful and appropriately nightmarish. But there's very little here that's actually got a sound foundation in either story purpose or logic. Yet I find myself re-evaluating it as time goes on. I have to concede that in straying into a territory where nothing really adds up, it skews the closest to Craven's original. The other films have plenty of elaborate dream sequences, but usually signal pretty quickly where the dream begins and ends. Nightmare 2 lacks a clarity that makes it constantly disorientating. There's an interesting bleed-through in that. I can't qualify how intentional it all was, given that it was a pretty rushed cash-in, but I have to give credit where credit is due. The line between dreams and reality is still reasonably blurred, even when Freddy, for example, starts hacking up kids at the pool party. Though within a seemingly real-world setting, the character of Jesse has somehow morphed into him, essentially creating a waking nightmare figure.
You are all my children now.
The Dream Master feels like a project in the hands of a talented, hungry young director. There are imaginative nightmare sequences, utilizing dynamic camera work and inventive in-camera special effects trickery. The franchise was at the peak of its popularity here, and Freddy mania was rampant.
Well, a ripping good yarn, as you can see, and you can catch a full hour of Freddy later tonight on MTV on the Freddy Krueger Video Hour.
But this resulted in a cynical change of focus for the movies, and so despite this making the most money of the main series, here's where the series begins to show the shift that would lead to what I'd consider a premature ending for a mainstream horror franchise. Robert Englund gets top billing in the credits. The remaining Dream Warriors are killed off within the first half hour, leaving a fresh batch of teenagers to take up the reins, nearly all of whom are also killed off. There's little attention given to them, and as a result of summarily wiping them out, the narrative shifts from Freddy's original crimes and his vengeance to him continuing to kill to collect his victims' souls, a thread started in the previous film, but now being his main motivation.
Bring me more.
This narrative shift in allegiance to focus on Freddy subsequently shifts an audience allegiance to enjoying his killing. Freddy is now the star, and we are no longer being asked to invest much in the survivors or victims. This marks a huge change from the original template, as Craven always highlighted the villainy, not the villain. As proof of that, consider that in each of the 3 death scenes in the first film, Krueger himself barely appears. The characters instead observe being slain from the waking perspective. Freddy's humour has changed at this point too. Much of Freddy's power has always depended on a certain kind of dark humour and how he plays with his victims. But let's consider the shift in tone. In Nightmare 1, in 2 separate scenes, he unflinchingly assaults his own body. He is aware of his invulnerability, and uses that to further taunt his victims. In the scene where Nancy is trying to climb the sticky stairs, Freddy appears mockingly wearing Tina's face. But in Dream Warriors, Freddy is given much more room to showcase his personality. Now his delivery of James Bond-style quips before or after a kill serve to make him infinitely more appealing to watch. Freddy initially had a sense of humour that only he should find funny, but now his humour is geared so that everybody can find him funny. Though possessing an ironically enjoyable appeal, the series becomes very far removed from its beginnings, and becomes diluted to a point that is almost unrecognisable as the same thing.
How's this for a wet dream?
The Dream Child was released less than a year from the release of the Dream Master. This was a critical misfire, and from a commercial standpoint, the lowest performing entry in the main series, returning the franchise to pre-popularity levels of box office gross, though still technically a success against its budget. There could be a few reasons for the steep decline, but the most obvious to me is oversaturation. The Dream Child's predetermined release date before a script was in place resulted in a rush production to meet the deadline. The quick-fire succession of sequels means there's far less chance to build anticipation for where the story might go, and even a fan-favourite character's next appearance.
It's a boy!
There was perhaps an overestimation in how much an audience could tolerate, as the quick release of The Dream Child is not the only culprit here. Premiering only 2 months after the release of The Dream Master came Freddy's Nightmares, a television series that lasted 2 seasons between 1988 and 1990. Freddy largely served only as host to the show, essentially a series of anthology horror tales set in Springwood, though he does sometimes feature as an episode antagonist. And of course, alongside both TV and film releases was an avalanche of merchandising, nearly all of which featured Freddy as the focus. These images show a 1989 Elm Street catalogue that showcased a wide variety of available products, though this is just a small example of the product Freddy appeared on. By the time we get to Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare, only 7 years on from the original film, Freddy has tipped over into self-parody. This is signalled right at the beginning, when the credits mock the slightly self-aggrandizing quotations that opened parts 3 and 4. The series certainly leaned into favouring black comedy over horror early on, with Freddy's one-liners, but it's much more overt here. As the audience's allegiance has shifted at this point, Freddy as a character makes the audience complicit in his killings. For example, the scene where the character Carlos is rendered deaf. As he walks around the boiler room, Freddy appears, looks at the camera, and proceeds to mock Carlos by shouting and dancing all around him, all of which happens while Carlos is oblivious. This short segment ends with Freddy once again looking straight at the audience before he disappears to begin the next stage of torment. This parodic comedy occurs again in the scene where Freddy wheels out the bed of nails to impale a falling victim, again accompanied by a direct look at the camera. You could well imagine Bugs Bunny in his place. The decision to make Freddy the only continuity throughout the series means that the audience is being asked to go through a similar experience each time. Thus, while the series stands out from the other slasher franchises of the period due to its considerable personality, the repetition of the experience could be seen as a missed opportunity to expand on Craven's original in many ways.
Time to start all over again.
But this isn't Springwood!
Every town has an Elm Street.
In addition to the dominance of Freddy over relatable characters, we must also consider story limitations. In theory, Freddy's domain should offer unlimited potential for expansion. Essentially, anything conceivable should be showable on screen, without being beholden to logic or reason, because the unconscious mind is unlimited by such things. Though the visual parameters of the series offer immense elasticity in theory, it requires a filmmaker who knows how to use them to make the audience either enjoy the ride or care about the characters in jeopardy, something increasingly hard to do when the villain is the showcase. Think of the Dream Master's Nightmare Kaleidoscope, or the Dream Child's Escher Stairs sequence, for instance. Disorienting creative imagery designed to try and keep the audience off kilter. But these sequences, as imaginative as they are always tied to a repeating narrative. What exactly are the stakes if Freddy can simply return each time he's defeated? However, if this series of huge visual scope burned itself out after only 7 years, why did some of Freddy's rival boogeymen, like Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees, endure for more sequels? It could be said that there is an advantage to aiming low. While Craven's original Nightmare was ambitious in scope and execution, John Carpenter's Halloween is noted for its simplicity and efficiency. Sean Cunningham, director of Friday the 13th, aimed to cash in on Halloween's success, with only the work of effects maestro Tom Savini lending it a more gruesome edge. Their modest beginnings may have helped set low expectations for future installments, leaving less room for disappointment when each film essentially repeats the previous experience. Both franchises experienced drops in box office gain also, but neither dominated the pop culture landscape like Elm Street, leading to inevitable audience exhaustion. In the nearly 3 decades since Wes Craven again rewrote the rulebook with Scream, the face of horror has changed dramatically. Self-reflection and meta-commentary gave way to a torrent of recycling and remakes, which rather than establish a new foundation for franchises, only served to generate reverence for the old guard. Legacy sequels are all the rage, and every franchise worth its salt is dusting off its old heroes and villains for a further showdown. Michael Myers walked back to Haddonfield for an extended 3-film final confrontation with Laurie Strode. Chucky the Killer Doll now has his own TV series, which embraces the fan servicing of bringing back characters from the original Child's Play whilst also pitting him against new updated adversaries. Scream, once a groundbreaking genre buster, has now become a standard slasher franchise since its own legacy sequel in 2022, largely irrelevant to both the culture and the genre since 2010's fourth entry. The franchise has become more and more introverted, seeking to give more attention to its own meta-stab franchise, whilst awkwardly shoehorning in wider commentary on horror's minor movements, such as toxic fandom, rather than capturing the zeitgeist like it did in 1996.
Oh, there's two of you. Again. I've seen this movie before.
Not this movie, Sydney.
You really need some new material.
I got you here, didn't I?
You might actually be the most derivative one of all. I mean, Christ, the same house.
Maybe so. But you forgot the first rule of surviving a stab movie. Never answer the...
I'm bored.
Wait!
But if Legacy is so popular, where's our favourite fedora-wearing, razor-fingered Phantom? Aside from the current legal issue of the Elm Street rights returning to Wes Craven's estate, what's holding up another walk down Elm Street? Why doesn't Elm Street go down the Legacy sequel route? Well, the series already has its own successful Legacy sequel in everything but label, 1987's Dream Warriors. Both a critical and commercial success upon release, Dream Warriors, with Wes Craven back in the mix, does what many Legacy sequels have done. They tend to make the choice of ignoring sequels that came before them. Indeed, Dream Warriors does not write Nightmare 2 out of the canon, but simply doesn't reference its events. They tend to be set a reasonable amount of time from previous events. Nancy confirms during a group therapy session that the events of the original Elm Street took place 6 years before. They reintroduce iconic franchise heroes while setting up new characters to pass the torch to. Nancy Thompson returns to the fold, again played by Heather Langenkamp, now as a therapist attempting to help the remaining Elm Street kids. They tend to call back to the original premise to serve as a finale. Freddy's backstory is uncovered, and he and Nancy have a final confrontation resulting in Freddy's defeat and Nancy's death. As well as covering the essential ingredients required of a Legacy sequel, more detrimental to the idea of skipping over it to create another is how the fans of the series widely acknowledge the validity of Dream Warriors as a worthy follow-up to the original. The film may take a more populist approach with the material, creating more colourful, elaborate nightmares, and make Freddy more talkative, but he remains the villain, in part thanks to the return of a beloved heroine and the character work on the new teens. The Dream Warriors are not regarded as throwaway cannon fodder. Although there is humour in the film, they each bring their own unique trauma to proceedings, in an environment where their murders are mistaken for suicide. Freddy is using the adult's lack of perspective to make it seem as if they are responsible for their own deaths. This grisly notion grounds the proceedings despite the fantastical settings, and encourages the audience to care about their fates, rather than simply enjoying the various creative death scenes, which are by themselves still celebrated as franchise highlights, expanding on the earlier visual palette. Only the business motivation to use the success of the film to create another sequel stops this being the de facto finale of the series. It's too legitimate a successor to ignore, particularly with the death of Nancy.
I won't let you die. I won't let you. I'm gonna dream you into a beautiful dream. Forever and ever.
Add to this the more practical obstacle that Robert Englund now considers himself too old to be able to convincingly portray the physicality required in playing Freddy. So what about another remake? Not impossible, but a remake of a franchise is a tricky thing, as we saw when Platinum Dunes attempted it, bolstered by their success with remakes of other properties such as Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Friday the 13th. Robert Englund is the elephant in the room here, as perhaps Chucky aside, no other franchise villain within horror has become so synonymous with the actor who plays him. Therefore, an audience may have a difficult time accepting another actor in the role. Any remake would also have to carry enough of the franchise iconography so that it would be recognisably Nightmare on Elm Street, whilst also treading enough new ground to be considered worthy of a remake in the first place. Samuel Bayer's 2010 remake struggled with many of these aspects. In an effort to take things seriously and stand apart from the now familiar wisecracking Freddy that had become the mainstay, they sought to rein in Freddy's personality. Constructing a narrative thread about Freddy potentially being a victim of mob injustice could have been an interesting diversion from established events, but in the mind of the fan base, that's not the character they fell in love with. Later in the film, it's established that Freddy is indeed the monster we all know him to be, which makes his anger about his death feel misaligned and not as rich as his acceptance of power and status in the original series. An additional contribution to the lack of personality was in the new makeup design. While not being a million miles from Freddy's established look, which did alter a little between films, the tightened skin approach diminished Jackie Earle Haley's facial flexibility, so an audience couldn't see adequate expression as he dispatched his victims. But perhaps the most egregious example of where the previous remake failed is in the way it drew direct comparisons with the original film by deadlifting iconic scenes from it.
Yeah, I'm fine, Mom.
All right, I'm going to bed.
Okay.
Nancy.
Don't you want to hang out, Nancy?
Along with heavy nods to the sticky stairs, the bed spurting blood, and Nancy's mother being sucked through the front door. In their replication, there's a strange misunderstanding or ignorance about how and why these scenes worked in the original. Sometimes it's the timing, lacking the playful switch between dreams and reality. But for the majority, it's the obvious and ineffective decision to replace the practical effects of the original with CGI. It is perhaps this that makes me contemplate the relevance of Freddy in the modern age above all. More than most of the horror tentpole franchises from the 80s, Elm Street depends on a certain degree of special effects. The remake stood out for the absolute lack of impact of anything there had. As we move increasingly into a digital world where anything that can be dreamt up can now be put on screen, and where we move from a photochemical reaction to image capture in a series of bits, I wonder how relevant Freddy's brand of horror would be in a cinema landscape that increasingly lacks a sense of tangibility. Even the lower-ranking outings in the original Elm Street series had one thing up their sleeve: the magic trick, when teenagers are transformed into cockroaches or into a human marionette. The effects wizardry in the series is elaborate, multifaceted, and practical. There is a well-established relationship between the actor and their having something physical to interact with, which comes across on the screen. But there is also something about the illusion and the stretchy, gooey, visceral nature of the effects from this period that amplify the discomfort felt by the audience. In the modern era, where anything can be done by computer, an audience has far less trust in a filmmaker and approaches with a more cynical, observational eye. Absolute death to a horror film, designed to grip an audience and ask it to hold its breath until the end. We must also consider the rise of elevated horror, a term coined much more by journalists than the filmmakers or the audience, but nonetheless an important turning point for the genre. The past few years have seen a series of notable films that have depended much more on dank, brooding atmosphere than outright shocks or gore, most prominently from Studio A24. These all have their own fairly unique architecture and have become known as elevated horror due to their layers of subtext and lack of what might be considered a mainstream appeal. Would today's audience accept the guilty pleasures of Freddy? After all, so-called elevated horror is really just horror. The problem with such terms is that it reinforces the stigma that horror has had to fight against since its inception. As Scott Tafoya writes, the horror genre never had a problem that needed to be fixed by somebody like Ari Aster. What it has always had is a respectability problem, and the term elevated horror is just a way to con critics into praising something. It is easy to think that a modern audience could look back on the Elm Street series and understand that it's a product of its time and find things to like. But how well could a new entry hold up against films that would markedly stand apart from it? The original Elm Street was released in what would be considered by most to be the slasher heyday, and while slasher films haven't entirely died out, we must consider that we no longer live in that time. Previously, intelligent satire could be wrapped up in a commercially appealing and digestible package. See Paul Verhoeven's RoboCop or Starship Troopers, or Joe Dante's Gremlins or The Burbs. But it could be that that era is now too far removed for an audience to relax enough to enjoy Freddy's killing spree on even a gleeful ironic level, never mind actually seeing past the wall stretching and blood spewing to consider it having any deeper meaning or merit. If we consider that while financially successful, the remake was derided by both critics and audience alike, the changing face of horror, and the almost immediate decline in quality in order to promote a child-molesting serial killer to superstar status, it is perhaps best that Freddy remains an icon of a previous age, to be acknowledged but not resurrected. In my opinion, it simply comes with too much baggage to bring back.